Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. I'm your host, Erik Bjornstad, and I'll be your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. Here at the podcast, we talk about anything and everything that's related to all the different kinds of fuel that we use both at work and at home. Plus, we talk about anything and everything related to all the different things that use those fuels, again, at work and at home. And that means that the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is really for everyone. So, what are we going to talk about on today's episode? Well, fuel management professionals and longtime listeners to this podcast both know the seriousness of microbial contamination situations in today's stored fuels. We've addressed that particular issue in a bunch of different ways. We talked about how it happens. We talked about what makes today's ultra-low sulfur diesel fuels a lot more prone to developing these microbe problems than the fuels of the past used to be. We talked about a number of the best practice recommendations for both preventing microbial problems and also for getting rid of them when you do find that you have one. We talked about the different kinds of testing that are best for detecting microbe problems when you do think that you have one. And we talked about, again, best practice recommendations on the kinds of things that you should do on an ongoing basis to ensure that, first of all, if you do have a microbe problem, you can get rid of it without it causing too much damage, but then also minimize the chances that that's going to come back. Now, on that last point, the key factor in that, or maybe the key thread that runs through all of this, is getting rid of all the water. Oh, just kidding. This is not it. No, though it is something that you should do if you have a free water bottom in your tank, because free water presence usually does go hand in hand with microbial problems developing. But no, applying biocides, that is the biggest key factor for resolving microbial contamination, because in order to eliminate a microbial contamination problem, you have to kill the microbes. You cannot just remove the water and they go away. It does not work that way. You have to kill the microbes. It's kind of like if you have an infected wound, right? It's fine to clean it up, wipe out, the blood and the dirt and the pus, whatever's in there. But unless you take an antibiotic or you apply, a neosporin or, something like that, unless you do that particular thing to make sure that the infection gets killed, you're probably not going to end up healing properly. But having said all that, which biocide to choose for your particular needs? There are more than a few trade names of biocides out there, representatives of different biocide chemistries that may be a little bit different when you compare them, but they all have the same basic job: to kill as many different kinds of microbes they come in contact with and to maintain that kill for as long as possible. So, probably the 5 most well-known broad-spectrum biocides that are widely available in the marketplace are Biobor, or what we would call a diboronane chemistry; Biocide, the thiocyanate chemistry; Kathon, the isothiazolone chemistry; Clearkill, the MBO chemistry; and Dow Fuel Saver, the nitromorpholin biocide chemistry. So 5 of the most well-known ones. And the key thing that binds all of these together, the key commonality that they have, is that they are all approved for use in fuels and fuel oils. They also have some other approved uses for at least some of them, like some of them are approved for use in going into wastewater as well. But there's a new player in the market, or maybe not completely new, but it's one that you probably heard of or come across before. And it's a different kind of player because it has one defining characteristic that makes it completely unique compared to any of those other 5 that we mentioned. It's a characteristic that its maker really tries to capitalize on and use it to set it apart from the others. And that is that it is a solid stick form of biocide. Some people might call them bug sticks, you'll hear that referenced, but we would call them solid biocide sticks. Some people may even call them biocide pucks, but you get the idea. It's a solid form of biocide. But if you've ever had them pitched to you, you might recall that that pitch might have gone something like this. Yeah, biocides are pretty important, but they're also kind of messy and difficult to handle. And who wants to run the risk of spilling some biocide on themselves when it's a hot, sweaty summer day and you're working on top of a really hot AFT? Biocide bug sticks will solve that problem for you. You just take them, you drop them into your tank, and then you forget it. No mess, no spilling of liquids, just great biocide protection without the mess or the hassle. Or some version of that, right? Now, on the face of it, those can be compelling arguments when you're a fuels manager or you're a worker in the field and part of your sphere of responsibility is doing this kind of thing. They can be compelling arguments. So that's what we're going to talk about today. One of the newer and more compelling options among the field of essentials needed to eliminate microbial contamination problems in stored fuel and fuel systems. Solid biocide sticks, bug sticks. Are they going to be right for your system compared to using a conventional biocide like Biocide or Biobor? Well, as we say with many things, the devil is in the details here, so let's find out. Biocides are widely used across multiple industries for control and elimination of microbial contamination problems. Now, due to their nature, due to what they are, biocides are highly regulated and they fall under the jurisdiction of the EPA's Division of Pesticides. And what they will do is, after they gather and review all the relevant technical information, the testing information, the safety data for the biocide chemical in question, they will, if it passes all of their criteria, they will approve certain biocide chemistries, not just for general use as an antimicrobial, but the approval will be conditional in terms of which contexts or which situations that biocide chemistry can be used, when, where, and how much. And we say can be used in the sense that from a legal standpoint, you're really supposed to stick to what or how the approval covers as far as its use. In other words, it's frowned upon legally to use or direct others to use a biocide in violation of the parameters of its approval. Because if you think about it, where and how you use a pesticide or a biocide, that matters. It doesn't just matter if a pesticide or a biocide will kill bacteria, kill molds and yeast and fungi. It matters if it's going to work safely and effectively in the areas that you're proposing to use it in. And so to get such approvals, the biocide registrators, if you will, have to provide ample evidence that that's true. So, as I said, biocide approvals by the EPA are based in large part on what the technical information submitted and studied shows about both how effective it is and how safe it is, both for the user, but also for the environment too. How safe and how effective that biocide is under these possible usage circumstances that you're requesting the approval for. So let's take an example to illustrate this and wrap all this up. Let's say that somebody had formulated a biocide that is intended to go into gasoline at the gas station. They apply for the approval. They submit lots of testing evidence that shows that it kills microbes. Great. But not just that. They also have to show that it isn't going to create deposits in the gasoline that will end up harming the engine, harming the injectors. They typically in the industry refer to that kind of data as no harm data, because what good would it do if you had a biocide that killed everything in gasoline you needed it to, but it wrecked your engine? Now, that's a rhetorical question we're asking because we know the answer to that question, right? Okay, so we say all that because that concept of a conditional approval, That's going to matter a little bit later on as we delve a little deeper into the pros and cons of these solid biocide sticks that we're considering. And in order to do that, let's set the stage to better help us understand these solid biocide sticks better so we can have a bigger picture understanding of what they're actually good for and what they may not actually be good for. First, let's talk about the chemistry. Solid biocide sticks are marketed as convenient, easy to handle biocide application forms. They differ from liquid biocide products because they don't need to be measured volumetrically. You take one stick, you drop it into the tank, it sinks down to the bottom, and you leave it there. And over time, it's supposed to dissolve and feed biocide into the fuel and the liquid around it. Part of the rationale is that the biocide stick is going to dissolve within the tank liquid over a period of time, supplying a steady dosage of biocide chemistry into the liquid while it's doing that. Now, these solid form biocides, they're manufactured in three common shapes, if you will. There's sticks, there's pucks, and there's diamonds. Now, popular liquid biocide chemistries include the ones we mentioned earlier, the Kathon isothiazolone, the Biocide thiocyanate, Clearkill MBO. Those are popular liquid ones, and they're different biocide chemistries. The solid biocide sticks tend to be a different chemistry than those. Shorter name version for that, which we'll use from this point on, is bronopal or bronopal, depending on where you're from in the country. So bronopal chemistry is the biocide chemistry used in these solid biocide sticks. Now, what exactly is this stuff, bronopal? Well, bronopal has been pretty widely used as an antimicrobial agent and as a preservative agent since it was developed in the mid-19th century. And it was developed in the mid-20th century, off by 100 years. It was developed in the mid-20th century in the UK by the Boots Company. Now, ironically, the Boots Company is most well known in the UK nowadays as a large pharmacy chain store brand. So think as if Walgreens decided to develop a new biocide preservative. That might be the American equivalent. So because it was developed by the Boots Company, it makes sense that bronopal was initially created as an antimicrobial agent to be used in pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, and industrial products. As the years went on, use of bronopal expanded into other applications. Personal care products, think shampoos and lotions. They started using it more and more in industrial processes like controlling microbial growth in cooling water systems and in paper mills and oil fields, places where they happen to use an awful lot of biocide. Now, as an aside, go back to personal care products that we mentioned a moment ago. You'd be really surprised to learn that products like liquid soaps and shampoos, they can actually develop microbial growth in them if they're left too long. It's because of the water content that they have. And so they do tend to use a substantial amount of biocide preservatives in those kinds of products in order to maintain their shelf life. The preceding decades, as the 20th century went on, it became particularly popular in industrial water treatment usage. They used it in there to control bacteria in recirculating water systems and in oil field operations. And it was pretty effective against a wide spectrum of bacteria, especially this kind of bacteria that causes a lot of problems in those situations called the sulfate-reducing bacteria. And because it could kill those pretty effectively, it made it pretty valuable to use to prevent biofouling and corrosion in. So things are looking pretty good right now, right? And because it's been proven so effective at preventing the growth of bacteria in water-containing products, that leads to it gaining approval from regulatory bodies in other countries, including the FDA here in the United States, so that it can be used in a wide range of consumer products, like those shampoos we talked about earlier. But as they're doing this, people start becoming more and more aware of environmental issues and safety issues. Awareness of environmental and health impacts is steadily growing among the populace, and concerns are starting to be raised about potential release of formaldehyde, which is a byproduct of bronopal degradation when it breaks down. And they're especially concerned about that in cosmetic formulations. And so what happens is that they start developing alternatives for use. They start making the regulations incrementally just a little bit more stringent. And so those two things kind of come together, and bronopal's use in consumer products like cosmetics dropped pretty precipitously. So despite these use-specific limitations that developed, and when we say use-specific, recall what we talked about in the opening part of the podcast about how biocide approvals are contingent on how it's used and where it's used. So that's what we mean when we say use-specific. So despite these limits, bronopal is still being used pretty commonly in a lot of other industrial applications where it's still really effective and really valuable. It remains an important biocide in industrial applications like, remember, the waste treatment, the oil field applications, pipelines. They use it a lot in large bulk crude oil and bulk fuel oil storage at places like terminals where you have these huge multi-million gallon tanks. They're using a lot of bronopal in there. Despite its waning use in consumer goods, bronopal still remains an important chemical in all these other industries because it's so effective in those areas. So now that we've set up the history, let's compare solid bug sticks to liquid biocides. While liquid biocide formulations do still remain the most common antimicrobial chemical form used, the people making the solid form biocides, they're committed to try and make as many inroads into as many different areas of use as possible. In order to do this, they have to make a case about why someone should use a solid biocide stick in that area. They must make a case that solid biocide sticks offer important advantages over liquids. And they have to make the case that those advantages are ones that are valuable or that they should matter to the various types of consumers they're targeting. And the case that they're making for the advantages of these solid biocide sticks, using them over the liquid forms, it's often framed by giving some versions of the following arguments. First one is a convenience and handling argument, okay? Solid biocide sticks are cleaner and easier to handle than liquid biocides are. And that can matter if you're a company that's got inexperienced personnel working with biocides. Maybe they're not sure how to use them. It can also matter if the conditions are hot, sticky, and sweaty. Increases the chances that you spill some of the liquid. So that might be a situation where you might say, hey, maybe a solid stick that I can pick up in my hand like this, my gloved hand, maybe that would be better. So there's a convenience and handling argument. There's also an ease of dosing argument because liquids require liquid volumetric measurements. And that can be messy and involves, again, that risk of spillage. Whereas a solid biocide stick, in theory, is easier to dose if you follow their simple directions. A solid biocide stick, theoretically, is easier to dose if you follow their instructions. And then there's a third aspect of the argument they would make, which is the microdosing ability. Solid biocide stick, when you drop them into a tank, they're going to sit there and they're going to dissolve over time. And that means, in theory, you could use them to maintain a constant microdosing of biocide into the fuel or the liquid over a longer period of time than liquid dosing would allow. Okay, so convenience in handling, ease of dosing, and microdosing ability. On the face of it, those points might seem to be worthwhile characteristics that may have substantial appeal to a fuels manager or to anyone else who might be aware of the important critical role that biocides play in resolving microbial contamination problems or preventing them in the first place. So far, this all sounds pretty good for the solid sticks. And I always like to say that nothing is completely good and nothing is completely bad. Even if you have something that seems to have a lot of problems, there are still always at least some good points that thing will bring to the table, and vice versa too. And that's the kind of situation that we have here as well. In spite of those positive claims made for the advantages of those biocide sticks, solid biocide sticks still have some substantial hurdles that may either negate some of those advantages or might even, and this is important to talk about, might even prohibit their usage altogether in certain markets and certain usage areas that they otherwise might be seeking to make inroads into. And if you're someone who's looking at possibly using a solid biocide stick as a solution for your stored fuel to eliminate or control microbial contamination, there are some things that are going to be really important for you to know, things that might end up helping make your decision for you. And we're going to summarize these as 6 problems that solid biocide sticks have. Let's start off with the one that might be the most important consideration depending on how you're proposing to use the biocide. And that problem number 1 is they are not approved for use in on-road fuel or fuel storage tanks that have on-road fuel in them. Okay, so remember, we're talking about the bronopal chemistry here. So bronopal solid biocide sticks cannot be used in either on-road fuel, that's gasoline or diesel, or in storage tanks holding on-road fuel. And they can't be used there for one big, ultimately insurmountable reason. They do not have legal approval to be used in on-road fuel. Again, gasoline or diesel. And that applies both to the solid bronopal forms, as well as if you happen to find a liquid bronopal formulation, it would actually apply to that too. That chemistry cannot be used there. So let's explain. Remember from earlier, we said it's not legal to use a biocide in ways that the biocide is not legally approved to be used in. And that is what is the case here. So what are we actually saying? Are we saying that bronopal doesn't have approval to be used as a biocide? No, obviously not, because it has been legally used as a biocide by lots of people in lots of different industries for decades. So that is not the problem here. But remember, what we talked about a few minutes ago, biocide registrations and biocide approvals, those are conditional. Every approved biocide, the approval has terms and limitations that define how and where and when it can be used. The big problem that bronopal has for anyone considering using it in on-road fuel is its approval with the EPA Office of Pesticides does not include approval for use in on-road fuel, which means it's not legal to use bronopal there. Okay, so is this a case where the necessary approval just hasn't been granted because nobody happened to ask for it? You know, nobody submitted an application for bronopal approval for use in on-road fuel? No, would not be accurate to say that either. And we can say that because we can know for sure that even if they did apply for that approval, bronopal would not be approved for use in on-road fuel because of 2 inherent characteristics. Number 1, that bronopal chemistry, remember that long name we said? 2-bromo-2-nitropropane 1,3-diol. The bronopal chemistry contains a halogen element called bromine. It's an element not normally found in distillate petroleum fuels like number 2 diesel or gasoline. And that means that any biocide molecule containing bromine, it will not meet the EPA's essential, substantially chemically similar requirement for something to be approved to be added to on-road fuel. So even if they did apply to try and get bronopal approval to be used in on-road fuel, they would be turned down. The application would be rejected by the Office of Pesticides because you're not allowed to add bromine to on-road fuels. Number two, something more specific to the solid form biocides, not necessarily to the liquid. But for the solid biocide sticks, or the pucks, or the diamonds, all of those, they have to use a calcium carbonate binder to produce their solid form. Now, calcium, like bromine, also fails the substantially chemically similar requirement for addition to on-road fuel. So the bottom line is, if a biocide is not legally approved for use in a specific situation, like in wastewater or in on-road fuel, if it's not legally approved for use in a specific situation, then it's not legal to use it in that situation. And for both of those reasons we just mentioned a moment ago, the bronopal bug sticks are not and likely will never be approved for use in on-road fuel. That means that it would be illegal to put bug stick solid biocides in the on-road storage tanks for facilities like retail gas stations that some people pitch them for because maybe they don't know about this proviso. So, first big hurdle, number 1 of 6, is you can't use them in on-road fuel. Now we go on to the other 5 hurdles, which are practical problems for the bug sticks instead of regulatory problems. So problem number 2, bronopal solid biocide sticks are known to be water soluble but not fuel soluble. What that means is if you were to drop them in, say, a diesel fuel storage tank that had a little bit of water down the bottom, which is almost every tank, but it's only got a little bit of water down there at the bottom, it's not going to dissolve very well because it needs water to dissolve. It requires the presence of a sizable water bottom layer in a tank in order to dissolve. That's a key reason why solid biocide sticks are popular for use in bulk crude or fuel oil storage facilities. But any success that they have in those situations would not necessarily translate to them then working equally well in a place like a retail gas station. A retail gas station does not tend to have a lot of water in it, whereas an 8 million gallon storage tank for crude oil is going to have a pretty big water bottom layer in there for that stick to dissolve. Any tank of that size is going to have a very sizable water bottom in which that stick can dissolve successfully. And then when you contrast that with a retail gas station tank or one of those small to medium fuel storage tanks at, let's say, a fire station, those tanks have negligible water bottoms in the grand scheme of things. And that means dropping a bug stick into such a tank, you're going to get incomplete or even negligible dissolving of that biocide stick. And that means biocide chemistry itself is not going to be getting into the fuel as you're intending. So, problem number 1, you can't use them in on-road fuel. Problem number 2, they only really dissolve in water, not fuel. Problem number 3 also concerns how the sticks dissolve. See, not only do they require water to dissolve, there's one other necessary condition that they need, and that is presence of a fuel flow, moving fuel, moving liquid. Solid biocide sticks dissolve off the principle of what they call erosion feeding, where you have, if this is your puck or your diamond, and you have liquid moving over its surface, that liquid, as it moves, is going to slough off, or it's going to erode continually that top layer of the stick or the puck or the diamond. And that allows the biocide chemistry in that top layer to disperse into the liquid around it, right? If that biocide stick, that solid biocide form, is going to fully dissolve, it's going to need continual fuel flow to keep sloughing those outside layers off until it's gone, until it's fully dissolved. Now, how much flow does it actually need? Now, requirements are a little bit situation dependent, so we have to make it a little bit of a generality. But the general rule of thumb, if you ask someone in the industry, is a biocide stick is going to need a minimum fuel flow of about 5 gallons per minute in order to fully dissolve, plus having a free water layer present at the same time. Now, as you may guess, most non-industrial fuel storage situations, they don't have 5 gallons per minute fuel flow in order to enable this to happen. And this helps explain why there are many non-industrial users who had used these biocide sticks over time, and they almost universally report partially dissolved biocide sticks in the bottom of their storage tanks months or even years after dropping them in. And if you have a partially dissolved biocide stick, that means that the fuel was not being treated with biocide as you intended when you put it in there. So that's number 3. Problem number 4 is these solid biocide sticks tend to be associated with tank corrosion. I mean, it is one problem for you to add biocide to a tank because you've got microbial contamination, and maybe you come to find out that the biocide didn't actually make its way into the fuel to do the job you intended to, or it just didn't do its job at all. I mean, it's one thing to say that, but it's also known within the industry that as these partially dissolved biocide sticks sit on the bottom of the tank, ever slowly dissolving or maybe not even dissolving at all, they're sitting there and they're contributing to a problem that is, on the face of it, much greater than the microbial problem that they were put in the tank to eliminate in the first place, and that is tank corrosion damage. There have been plenty of reports that bronopal sticks sitting on the fuel storage tank bottom surfaces have been shown to damage the integrity of the storage tank in the area where they sit. And if that happens, now you're looking at a much bigger problem to deal with. Because, microbial contamination can be expensive to remediate, but fixing tank corrosion damage, that ultimately dwarfs any kind of microbial contamination you might be dealing with. So that's 4. Problem number 5, bronopal causes engine deposits when it's used in gasoline. So we discussed how bronopal solid biocide sticks, they haven't been approved for use in on-road fuel because they contain bromine. That means they don't meet the substantially chemically similar requirement. And this requirement for only biocide or fuel additive chemistry constituents that are substantially chemically similar to fuel components, this kind of requirement was put into place in order to minimize the chances of damaging the engine, minimize the chances of damaging compounds being present or being formed in the treated fuel. They don't want that to happen. Now, it's known within the industry that the bromine compounds in bronopal, they form damaging deposits when they're used in gasoline. So when you put bronopal in gasoline, then you expose it to the heat and the pressure of the engine environment. The bromine doesn't just disappear or change into another, magically change into another element. No, it breaks down into various byproducts. Some of the byproducts are less volatile, meaning they don't evaporate, they don't fly away, so to speak. They stay in the gasoline. And because they're less volatile, they will condense onto engine components like injectors. Some of these byproducts are bromine-containing compounds because when the fuel is being burned and you're in a very hot environment, the bromine will form bromine radicals. And these radicals will then look around looking for something to react to, and they'll combine with other substances in the fuel, and they'll form what's called brominated hydrocarbons, and those form deposits, or they're one of the things that form deposits. And there's also nitro compounds, or elements that have nitro groups coming off of them, like nitrogen and oxygen, like NO2. Those will also react during combustion, and they will also form these nitro compounds that also will contribute to deposits forming. So bronopal forms engine deposits because both of these are parts of its active molecule, the biocidal molecule. That problem is substantial enough that fuels professionals will unequivocally advise against using bronopal in gasoline, whether it's on-road gasoline or otherwise. So that's number 5. And the last one, problem 6 of 6 for using bronopal bug sticks is the problem of erratic dosing. Now, recall that one of the benefits that they attributed to using these bug sticks was this conceptual microdosing scenario where you put a solid stick into a storage tank and you leave it to dissolve, and it dissolves at a constant rate over time. And as it's doing that, it's going to deliver this low constant rate of biocide treatment into the fuel over a long period of time. Now, on the surface, when you describe it like that, that scenario is portrayed as advantageous to the user because the user, theoretically, could expect that their storage tank would be continually treated by this steady dosage of biocide over a long period of time. So it sounds good on the surface, but the reality of the usage is actually pretty different than that. Leaving aside the hurdle that the biocide stick isn't going to dissolve as expected, it's also known within the industry that this erosion feeding characteristic of the biocide stick or the puck or the diamond, what that means in terms of how much biocide or the rate that the biocide is getting into the fuel, what that means is that biocide feed rate, the treat rate of the biocide that's getting into the fuel, it starts off relatively high in the beginning, but then it decreases over time until it becomes pretty negligible. So it's not a constant rate of feeding into the fuel. It's actually more of a curve. And that's a problem if you're expecting a constant dosage. This idea that you're going to get this constant, steady, low-dose microdosing of your tank if you use a biocide stick, it just isn't what they find happening in practice when people use them. So it's a good theory that dropping a biocide stick into your storage tank will give you long-lasting continual dosage protection, right? It's good in theory, but the reality looks very different and is, unfortunately, much less attractive than. So there we have it. The realities that solid biocide sticks like the bug sticks have some large hurdles to overcome in order to compete in the liquid biocide market. So how would we sum all this up? All the stuff we talked about in the last 40-something minutes. If you are in a position making decisions about the management and the maintenance of store fuels or storage tanks or fuel distribution systems, you likely are going to be presented with a choice of considering this new form of biocide treatment for your system. The solid biocide sticks, whether it's this bug stick trade name or another similar product trade name, they are indeed popular for use in certain industrial verticals like fuel production, pipelines, bulk crude or bulk fuel oil storage. They are used in those areas because those areas have inherent characteristics that mitigate the disadvantages that the solid form biocides have. Yet there is a reason these solid biocide sticks have not been used outside of these market verticals, these industrial verticals. Some of these stem from the practical negatives, like the inability to dissolve without water, the inability to dissolve without constant liquid flow, contribution to corrosive tank damage, and inconsistent biocide feed rate. Those are all hurdles for them to get over. But even if those negatives did not exist, you still have the regulatory prohibitions. No registration or no approval for using these solid biocide sticks in areas dealing with on-road fuel, i.e. retail gas stations. And you also have their known contribution to the formation of prohibitively damaging gasoline engine deposits. Even without the practical problems, these other additional negatives make bronopal solid form biocide sticks, frankly, an untenable choice for many non-bulk or non-industrial fuel care scenarios. So those are all things you should keep in mind when you're looking at having to make a choice for the fuels and the systems that you are involved in. And if there's one thing that we like to do here on the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, it's to give you the right information that you need so that you can confidently make the best decision, the right decision for you. And so that's going to do it for this episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. As always, links to things that we talked about in this are in the show notes. If you haven't done it already, feel free to subscribe to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast at your favorite podcast purveyor of choice, whether that's Apple Podcasts, whether it's Amazon, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, any of those. Also, if you haven't done so already, and if you liked what you heard, feel free to give a good review, because reviews are a really important thing to help the algorithms help people to find us. So that's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you very much for joining me today, and we will catch you next time at the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.